So good morning, everyone. Apologies for these technical glitches. So I'm very pleased to be able to present to you some of the work that we're trying to develop here on climate smart landscapes for New Zealand. As Christine mentioned, I've been here since the start of the year, and we'll be initiating some of this work along with coordinating the climate adaptation and mitigation portfolio at Manaaki Whenua Land Research. So I thought I'd just give you a little bit of background of where I've come from, not as much geographically, which is France, but as scientifically, and the ideas I'm bringing to this question of climate mitigation and adaptation. So my previous research as ecologist addressed classical questions in ecology of what plants and other biota do in ecosystems depending on their characteristics. And I applied this type of knowledge to asking questions about climate change resilience, especially in managed ecosystems like grasslands. Trying to understand what ecosystems can actually do for people and for their adaptation in the landscapes they live in. So I'll start with a sort of easy but hard question, which is, what good is biodiversity for humans? So it is very legitimate for some people to say, well, this is actually not even a question that could be asked, because what needs focus as a responsibility as humans is the intrinsic value of nature. However, we all know by now that biodiversity is essential for life on Earth, as it underpins ecosystem functioning and the overall functioning of Earth and the biosphere. This idea has come through the notion of ecosystem services to society, which many of you would be familiar with, which essentially define the contributions of nature to individual and collective quality of life. This thinking, which has been developing for a good 20 years now, has led to increasing consideration of these services in decisions, be they private and public, and that includes accounting approaches, but as well considering other dimensions like social and cultural dimensions of nature in people's life. As such, ecosystem services, or as they are called now, nature's contributions to people, have become an important element in biodiversity and environmental policy. For instance, through the International Strategic Plan for Biodiversity, which was running until this year, is extended due to current circumstances to 2021, known as the target, and as well underpinning many of the Sustainable Development Goals. So I'm going to extend this question by asking, what good is nature for people's adaptation to climate change? Nature-based solutions are broadly defined by IUCN as actions to protect, sustainably manage and restore natural and modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. As such, they encompass multiple types of actions, including actions of nature protection, conservation and restoration, and also the targeted management of some species, ecosystems, and ecological functions. So to give you a few more concrete examples, what I will call here nature's contributions to adaptation, to push forward the idea of nature's contribution to people and focusing specifically on adaptation, classically include climate change mitigation and risk mitigation, which you will be very familiar with. But the way we have, with international colleagues, expanded this idea has been to consider that ideas of that components of nature's resilience, so the ability to essentially absorb external shocks linked to climate change, and favoring transformability. So, for example, through the rearrangement of communities as climate changes, are also important contributions to adaptation, as are new economic activities and values that develop in places where ecosystems already do and will inevitably change under the effects of climate. So this consideration of nature-based solutions is one that is now prevalent in policy and practice, but still needs a fair bit of development. Nature-based solutions or nature's contribution to adaptation are often presented and managed one at a time, which does not seem to align with real life and management problems. First, although for important reasons, climate projections are presented one variable at a time, of course, each species, ecosystem, or human activity responded to multiple variables, and therefore it seems relevant to consider the combination of these variables. On the left-hand side of the Hawke's Bay region, presented here as an example, you see combined changes in multiple drivers of climate change, which clearly highlight that while some part of the region shown in blue, like mountains and coastal areas, will only be exposed largely to a single driver, some shown in red, like the inland plateau or the horticulture and viticulture area, experience combined changes in multiple drivers. So in this context, adaptation is about making decisions across all the impacts of all these drivers. In the next few slides, I'm going to use examples from an ongoing synthesis of integrated nature-based solutions in New Zealand. This slide here shows examples ranging from management interventions on farmland to nature management for protection of native ecosystems like tussock grasslands or native forests, of control of invasive species, and to ecosystem restoration. If we take an analytical approach to these solutions as responses to multiple impacts of multiple drivers, we need to consider drivers, impacts, and solutions, and their underpinning ecological mechanisms as a causal chain. So let us start, for the sake of example here, with response to increasing drought, which puts fodder production at risk. This risk is related to other management risks of loss of soils and nutrients. The diversification of pasture vegetation with a variety of species put into these pastures is proposed to support drought resilience. Ecological researchers have developed significant knowledge on which particular attributes of plants and soils, the green boxes here, can promote such resilience, along with co-benefits for erosion reduction and water quality regulation. But these aren't the only challenges for adapting to pasture to climate change. As you know, climate mitigation is also an essential national and international goal, and this can also be addressed by managing pasture composition and soils in ways that appear to overlap with requirements for drought resilience, with benefits for carbon sequestration and other desired benefits. We can continue digging a bit deeper into these examples if we consider adaptation to ongoing simultaneous challenges. So, for example, we're very topical at the moment from drought and associated fire risks, and also from more frequent floods in rural landscapes. Two types of solutions on farmland have been proposed and are already being implemented: pasture diversification and native plantings. And each of these targets a set, or what we call a bundle, of synergetic adaptation services, such as the ones that were just analysed for pastures. In contrast, managing wilding conifers that escape out of plantations can involve foregoing some adaptation benefits to mitigate risks like fire, biodiversity threats, and loss in aesthetic value. So in essence, to sum up, adaptation can be conceptualized as an integrated playing integrated responses to multiple impacts of multiple drivers, where bundles of nature-based solutions, the spheres on the slide, are co-managed within landscapes. And so adaptation is therefore like this manager in a way, here juggling the multiple roles to manage a landscape. So I hope that with this short arguments, I will have convinced you by now that adaptation is about integrating multiple issues with multiple solutions. I will now argue that this needs to be done not only at the scale of a paddock of a farm, but within entire landscapes or catchments. Indeed, as you will be well aware, decisions and managements. I just lost my slides again. They operate at landscape scale, because the landscape scale is where ecological processes are integrated and also where individual and collective values play out, especially in this country. So there is a unique challenge for integrated multiple values for adaptation in New Zealand. Landscapes are also an important component of the climate policy context, which needs to intersect with the impetus for adaptation and actions on the ground. And I'll point out also here an important issue when trying to think about adaptation at landscape scales in this country, which is to perhaps rethink the conservation approach where under the so-called fortress conservation idea or paradigm, conservation might be separated out from inlands from the areas that are being managed. I apologize, I'm running this blindly again. I've lost my screen again. So I'm hoping you're seeing a slide that talks about why we should also worry about why landscape patterns matter when wanting these multiple adaptation solutions, and especially multifunctionality through nature-based adaptation. So in brief here, I've figured...
Sandra, I think you might need to click to the next slide. Can you do that?
That's what I've been trying to do.
Do you want to try and minimize it and restart it again, Sandra, from where you want to kick off?
Yeah, okay, it works again.
Yep, there we go.
Now we're talking about why landscape pattern matters for multifunctionality and nature-based adaptation. So in this little figure here, I've tried to schematize what would seem like an easy question, but which becomes a really important one when thinking about landscape scale adaptation. So if we're thinking about carbon credits, for instance, and mitigation and carbon crediting, what we're going to want is to increase trees in landscapes to increase carbon sequestrations. This also has benefits of increasing wildlife habitat, flood and erosion regulation, but with the drawback, as I just pointed out, of increasing fire risk. However, it's not only about how much trees you have in the landscape. What we know very well from landscape ecology is how these trees are arranged in the landscape. So the x-axis on this figure, and comparing the little arrangements on the left-hand side to those on the right-hand side, it's about how they arrange. So for a same number of trees in the landscape, which means equal the same level of carbon sequestrations and equal the same carbon crediting, this might mean very different implications in terms of wildlife habitat, implications which we yet have to figure out on flood erosion and mitigation. And as we move towards a more fragmented landscapes with smaller patches of trees through the landscape, could also decrease fire risk. So people have been thinking about this with the idea of landscape designs and providing recommendations or templates about which landscape arrangements may be more favorable in what we will call climate smart landscapes. So here's an example for a template that was produced originally for Australia, and interestingly was backed up by an international synthesis across both temperate and tropical regions recently, which recommends that for a landscape to function optimally for both nature conservation and benefits to people, it might only allow a maximum of 30% intensive land use, so crops and fertilized pastures, for instance, as well as requiring at least 10% of land managed for biodiversity, strictly managed for biodiversity, and a total of 30% of lightly managed land. And as you know, New Zealand is very well placed, already reaching 30% of conserved land. But here we come across the question of its patterning in the landscape. I've taken just 2 short examples here where the amounts of the different types of lands are calculated. So one is the Mackenzie Basin, where we could be asking questions about the tension between extension of intensive use or ambitions to restore native vegetation and in particular forest, and how this could be not only distributed in terms of proportions, but especially across this landscape. Contrasting with other landscapes in New Zealand, like in the Waikato region, where questions are now where and how to reduce intensive use, and continuing challenges for protecting and increasing the restoration of native forest. However, it's all very well for us ecologists to come up with wonderful designs of landscapes that we might back up through our models, but adaptation is really about people, and it's about agency. So the set of relationships that are presented about pastures is the tip of the iceberg of a far more complex network integrating multiple solutions within landscapes. While the first entry point that is often considered for intervention is, of course, the ecosystem, and as I just argued, landscape management by all their actors, adaptation is also about how these management actions are going to feed into value chains. You know, how products, for example, are being harvested, how benefits are being accessed. That's, for example, for recreation, how to transform, distribute, and develop values across value chains. But more importantly, adaptation is really about considering managers and wider societal values, knowledge and know-how for implementing solutions, extension services, along with regulation by environmental policies, questions of access rights, and very importantly, how social capital is already available or might need to be developed among the multiple actors across catchments and landscapes, along with infrastructure and financial capital. So these types of questions are the ones that we will be addressing in the climate adaptation and mitigation portfolio with now starting research, where we are building on the strong foundations that we've already got across Manaaki Whenua on mitigation, especially through ecological research, strong ecological research on nature dynamics, and all the work that's already been ongoing on the social sides of adaptation. So with this, I'll leave you and thank you in advance for all your questions.
Many thanks, Sandra, and thank you for persisting through those technical difficulties. These things come along to try us, and I'm so delighted that we got there, and that was great. Look, we've got some really good questions come in, but I'm going to start with a really simple one first, and it might be just that we missed it in your speaking. About halfway through the presentation, you had a slide with 2 acronyms that I didn't get, and a couple of other people didn't either. You talked about NCP and NCA, and I just wondered if you could outline what they stand for.
Yeah, apologies if I went through those too quickly. So NCPs are nature's contributions to people. So as I pointed out, this is the term that is now used more broadly internationally to address ecosystem services in a broader way. And I'll note this is particularly important here in New Zealand because this term was coined to refer to multiple ways of valuing nature, so including by indigenous people. So it's broader than ecosystem services. And likewise, the NCA is the shorthand for nature's contributions to adaptation that I was speaking about all along this presentation. And apologies for my acronyms.
No, where would we be without them? We've had a really good question that I know will be close to many people's minds as well. What might be a good set of indicators to track progress when seeking to improve the ecosystem services capacity of our managed landscapes?
All right, so there's several parts to that question, I think. So what we're talking about here is the ecosystem's capacity to essentially support people in our landscapes. So there's a whole suite of indicators that have been used. Well, the first one is basically going through land cover and land use. That's the most basic one, but often that's not satisfactory. So already people have often used land cover by default, and it's rapidly obvious that one needs to at least bring in the land use, i.e. all the practices that go with various land covers. There's a number of indicators of vegetation and soils, for example, that have been commonly used. But what I'd like to emphasize here is that it's also about bringing in landscape scale indicators. So, for example, what's the diversity of particular land covers in a landscape? What's their level of connectivity, or conversely, their fragmentation? And as far as biodiversity indicators are going, I think it's also important to point out already existing, but also great promises from indicators that can be picked up by remote sensing, like indicators of vegetation greenness, but of vegetation stress, for instance, or soil indicators that are becoming more and more useful to give direct and real-time measures of ecosystem services.
Thanks, Sandra. And this is obviously a very complex and interconnected topic, and that's being reflected in some of the questions. So I've just chosen one more simple one. How do landscapes relate to water catchments?
Right. Yeah, this is a really good question. I was using them a bit interchangeably in my presentation. So as many people would know, landscape can be a bit of a fuzzy notion, and also depends on the discipline you're coming from. So landscapes here I use landscape as a broad term to refer to essentially the spaces of a few to tens of square kilometers that people live within and manage. And conveniently, often they coincide with catchments, but catchments might be larger than landscapes. In this country, catchments are really important in terms of regulations. And so ideally, for our types of studies and for decisions, we like to overlap landscapes and catchments. But I just want to emphasize that when it comes to people's living experiences and perceptions, the two might be slightly not fully overlapping. And so everything I was explaining here would apply to catchments as a particular subset of landscapes, if that makes sense.
Fabulous. That does make sense to me. So, and thank you for that. Sandra, we're going to call it a day for this webinar now. Thank you for all the questions that have come in. rest assured you will have some responses and answers directly from us on all of those. We have another webinar coming up next week, next Tuesday, and we're discussing issues relating to myrtle rust. So I know that will be of interest to many of you as well. So watch your emails for an invitation to that one. From here, from Hannah, Sandra and myself, I'd like to say goodbye for today, and we'll see you again next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.